Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, Associate Editor at The Washington Post. 25 days until Election Day, and after weeks of folks complaining about Vice President Harris not doing interviews, this week in the media, Kamala Harris seems to be doing everything everywhere all at once. And joining me now to talk about the strategy behind the Democratic nominee's media blitz is Tyler Pager, White House reporter for The Washington Post. Tyler, welcome back to First Look.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to see you.
You too, Tyler. So Vice President Harris did interviews in venues as diverse as television's 60 Minutes and Call Her Daddy, the most listened to podcast by women. And that's in addition to the Stephen Colbert Show and a town hall last night on Univision. What was the Harris campaign strategy in deciding which interviews to do?
Yeah, I think as shown by the diverse list of outlets you just named, their strategy right now is to try to get the vice president out everywhere in front of as many different audiences as possible. In conversations that we've had with senior campaign officials, one of the things that they've identified as being the vice president's largest issue is that not enough voters know who she is. Obviously, we've been in this incredibly compressed timeline in which she took over the campaign, had the convention, picked a running mate, and then started campaigning. And they just feel that a lot of voters continue to show in their polls that they have questions about Kamala Harris. What does she stand for? What is her background? And so these interviews are part of a last sprint, last ditch effort to get her in front of as many Americans as possible.
Tyler, do you know if this week will be the only week of the media blitz, or are there more interviews scheduled for the last 25 days?
I mean, we already know yesterday she committed to participate in a CNN town
Tyler,
hall.
we can't hear you. I'm not sure why.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Sorry about that. So we know that she's already committed to a CNN town hall later this month. That was on the date that she had agreed to debate Donald Trump. He did not agree to that debate, so instead CNN offered town halls to the campaign. Harris agreed to that. And I think we should expect to see her participate in other interviews. Look, the campaign is very clear. They think they need to get her in front of voters, in front of as many people as possible. And that's why they did a diverse range of media interviews. I would expect that to continue as well as they see more opportunities to get her in front of different types of voters as well. The range of Call Her Daddy to Univision to 60 Minutes, all reaching very different audiences. I think that's sort of a core element of the final stretch of campaigning for her.
Right, and that CNN town hall is scheduled for October 23rd in Battleground, Pennsylvania. I want to play some sound from the vice president's appearances this week. First from The View, and then one from Howard Stern. Let's listen.
Listen, I plan on having a Republican in my cabinet.
I got a list.
Yes, right. You asked me what's the difference between Joe Biden and me. Well, that will be one of the differences. I'm going to have a Republican in my cabinet because I don't feel burdened by letting pride get in the way of a good idea.
Yeah.
Right.
It's going to be Liz Cheney who you appoint. Am I correct?
I gotta win, Howard. I gotta win.
You gotta win. You gotta win.
And listen, but the thing about Liz Cheney, let me just say, she's remarkable.
So after listening to that, Tyler, what is the vice president's objective in saying she would appoint a Republican to her cabinet?
Yeah, one of the things that they feel that is the best chance of winning is to try to flip some more of these Republican-leaning independent voters that may have voted for Trump in the past, may have not voted for Trump, but that's one of the areas that they see the most room for growth in terms of growing her coalition, growing her support. They have put Liz Cheney out on the campaign trail with Kamala Harris, and that is part of this extensive outreach that the campaign has done to some of these prominent never Trump Republicans to try to bring them into the fold. And so on those, in those interviews saying, I'm going to bring a Republican into the cabinet is part of that larger effort to reach out to those voters, but also to try to rebrand herself a little bit. A lot of Americans see her as a California liberal. Trump has gone to extensive efforts to paint her, in his words, as, quote, radical. And so she's trying to change that perception. And by saying she would include a Republican in her administration, that's part of that sustained effort.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump appeared on Fox News's The Ingram Angle, Hugh Hewitt's radio show, the Ben Shapiro podcast, the right-leaning comedy podcast Flagrant. But Trump's refused to sit down with 60 Minutes. What's his strategy here?
He's running like he thinks he's winning, and his goal at this point is not to convince new voters, persuade people off the sidelines, but just to rally and motivate his base. It is very clear he is not reaching out across the aisle in the same way that Kamala Harris is with Republicans that are disaffected by Trump. The most outreach Trump has made is with Bobby Kennedy Jr., who has endorsed his campaign and become a top surrogate. But Trump is really just going and speaking right to the base. It is clear they're running very different strategies. Trump is trying to excite, motivate his base, get it to turn out, and Kamala Harris is looking to grow that base. I think if we start to see polls shift in a dramatic direction, which I don't expect to see given how stagnant they've been for quite some time, maybe we see a change in strategy. But at this point, Trump is very hyper-focused on, as you said, appearing in friendly media environments and not really stretching his base of support.
Mm-hmm. So they're both doing extensive media appearances, but for whom is it more important, Vice President Harris or the former President Donald Trump?
I think at this point, it's clear that Vice President Harris has more room or believes, her campaign believes that she needs to do this. She has more room to maneuver just because of the amount of people that are unfamiliar with her, or at least say they are unfamiliar with her. Obviously, she's been the vice president for almost 4 years at this point, ran for president in 2019. But Trump has obviously been president. He's run for president. This is his third time running for president, and he is a much more known quantity. Harris is someone who is still, getting known among many Americans, particularly those that don't tune into politics. And ultimately, Jonathan, as you know, that's where this election is going to come down to. Those people that are not actively engaged. It's a matter of, do they even show up to vote? And so those are the voters that the Harris campaign is trying to reach. And so they feel that they have much more work to do to get in front of those voters, not just one time, but 2 or 3 or 4 times in the next 20 or so days.
Part of that calculation is black men. To be clear, an overwhelming majority of black men vote Democratic, but the fact that there seems to be some slippage among that demographic has the Harris campaign concerned. And I bring that up because former President Barack Obama was on the campaign trail for the vice president yesterday in Pennsylvania, and there's stories today about the comments that he made at a campaign meeting where he had a direct message to black men. In short, synopsis: black women have had our backs, and now that one is running for president, we need to have theirs. Every time something happens to us, women are out there in the streets, supporting us. And so now it's time for black men to do the same here. This is all part of a bigger gender gap. There's another stories in the paper about how Donald Trump is running a sort of male-dominated, male-focused campaign. And again, I bring this up also because what triggered this, Tyler, is you're talking about basically the campaign being, how do you get those non-traditional voters to go to the ballot box as opposed to staying on the couch? Do you think, or I got lost in my own question, Tyler, and I appreciate. I'm so sorry. I'm basically trying to get to.
There's a lot going on, Jonathan. I'm sticking with you.
There is so much going on. And I just wonder the gender gap between the candidates. Men are gravitating towards Trump, not so much to Vice President Harris. How much of that is a concern for the Harris campaign?
I mean, I think it's a concern for both campaigns. It's clear they both see the danger in just really strongly appealing to men or women. I was really quite struck by former President Obama's comments last night in Pennsylvania. The rally in Pittsburgh, displayed what many Democrats and even some Republicans concede that he's one of the best public speakers in the party. But it was those comments before in that field office where he really laid in and said, as you just quoted or sort of paraphrased to Black men, you need to support Kamala Harris. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting about it is that Kamala Harris almost never talks about gender. Unlike what we saw in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was the Democratic nominee, and there was a lot of messaging and focus on the historic nature of her candidacy and her potential presidency. Harris has not made that a defining feature of her campaign. And so for Obama to really make that argument, well, it was quite remarkable. And we'll see if it works and how much more he's going to do. But just listening to him in that setting and at the rally, he was really just like pissed off. And I think, we'll see if that sort of anger channels into voter turnout. That is what his role is in this campaign, is to get people, motivate them, and mobilize them to the polls. And so it is definitely something. Clearly, they are deploying their best surrogate, Barack Obama, to try to ameliorate this problem of lack of enthusiasm, lack of support among Black men and men more generally, but particularly with Obama, as he was yesterday, really making the case to Black men.
Tyler, I will tell you, if Barack Obama is saying what he said yesterday in Pennsylvania, he is channeling and not just his own anger, but an anger within the community about why there are folks who are not supporting her, despite the fact of the former president's track record when it comes specifically to Black men. And that is what I think is fueling that anger from him, but also from others within the African-American community. Tyler Pager, as always, thank you. White House reporter for the Washington Post, as always. Thank you for coming to First Look and suffering through my word salad of a question. Have a good weekend.
Anytime. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Great to be with you.
It is time for the Opinions Roundtable, so let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post associate editor and columnist Ruth Marcus and Washington Post contributing columnist Ramesh Ponnuru. Ruth, Ramesh, welcome back to First Look.
Hi there.
Thanks.
So much to talk about. We'll get into the media blitzes that have been happening, but I want to start with Donald Trump's speech yesterday to the Detroit Economic Club, where he dissed Detroit in front of Detroit. Ramesh, make it make sense. How does he do that and not alienate the very people he needs to come out to the polls and vote for him?
Well, he's also, of course, attacked Milwaukee in Wisconsin. These are states that he needs. But I actually don't think it's going to be particularly harmful to him. These are states, like a lot of states, that have a geographic divide: urban, rural, suburban, and there is either hostility, resentment, or indifference to the city on the part of a lot of the people who are part of Trump's natural base. And so while you would think this would hurt him, I don't think that we see much evidence that it has hurt him. We didn't see any evidence that it hurt him in Wisconsin. He's still very competitive there, and he's still very competitive in Michigan.
Ruth, what do you think?
Well, I don't see Ramesh arguing that it helps him. It's a little hard to see the method to the madness here. To go in front of an audience of Detroit business people who have worked to improve conditions in the city and to then diss the city is not what a normal campaign, a normal candidate would do, what a normal campaign manager would advise. And while I don't think this is disastrous for the reasons that Ramesh explained, there's nothing that Donald Trump can do, as we've learned over the last very long 9 years, that is disastrous for him. It's not particularly smart either.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk about the media blitz by the vice president this week. I want to hear from both of you. Ramesh, you go first. Did Vice President Harris help herself this week with those interviews?
Well, I think she did put to rest the complaints, particularly from journalists, that she wasn't talking to us enough. I don't know that she really addressed the sort of the underlying concerns about her own lack of definition. The fact that, as Tyler was suggesting, there's still a sense from some voters that they don't know her, they don't know what she's about, what her views are. And I think that she's very careful. She seems very worried about making a mistake, and so there are maybe even a little some more non-answers to questions even than you expect from a politician. I think you certainly saw that in the 60 Minutes interview. I think that is partly because they're trying to run a kind of blank slate change campaign, and they don't want to get tied down too much on some of these specific issues, but I think it creates this problem, which is that it doesn't make that sense that they don't know her go away.
What do you think, Ruth?
I think she helped herself more than hurt herself, though I take Ramesh's point about the blandness and anodyne nature of some of the answers. That's what smart politicians do, by the way. They don't get themselves in trouble on hot button issues. However, what I would have liked to see this happen weeks ago. She hasn't been the nominee for that many weeks, but I thought it was a mistake to let the complaints about lack of interviews, lack of access both to traditional and non-traditional interview subjects boil up, to let the Trump campaign and its allies argue that she was avoiding because she's not capable of responding or answering questions. We've seen that she's fully capable of doing that because she's, President Trump has, just outright said offensively and that she's not smart, not capable of doing this. She's got a mental disability. This is outrageous. I think that I think she would have done better if she had done this, but done it several weeks earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Could I add one thing on the word?
Yeah, go ahead.
On the word salad point, which is just personally listening to both of these candidates, I don't find that Trump's rhetoric is more linear or coherent than what Harris says. It doesn't seem to me that there's any less word salad, and in fact, there's probably more when you listen to Trump.
Yeah, I would also add.
Salad wants a word with all of us. It's getting a bad rap here. Salad is good. You want a lot of ingredients in salad. Harris is linear in the way she talks. She just kind of tends, in my assessment, to use too many words to say the same thing, and in some times not enough of the thing. Trump is an entirely different story. He's on a different plane. He calls it the weave. I've likened it, and I did this when he first ran in 2016, to playing pinball. He just veers from like pinball bumper to pinball bumper. And he's always done that, but it's clearly gotten more extreme.
The weave. I call it the moth. He's just bouncing around and chewing holes into things. And also, can we just talk, I'm going to talk about the elephant in the room. He's an old man. We spent months talking about President Biden and his inability to, make linear thoughts. And the man was driven out of the race. So now we've got a 78-year-old Republican nominee who is doing worse than word salad. He's not making any sense. I will climb down off my soapbox now and turn our attention to the hurricanes. Listen, the country's been praying for the loss of lives and property in Florida, Georgia, North Carolina due to Milton and Helene. But politics quickly became a part of this, with Donald Trump and others spreading lies about the federal response. Ramesh, why is Trump doing this, even when local Republican officials are saying he's wrong and pleading with him to stop?
Well, I think that, again, we've had 9 years of Trump dominating the political news, and we know the MO at this point. And one thing that we can say reliably is that if there is an internet rumor or lie that is making the rounds that is convenient to him politically, he's not going to do due diligence and find out if it's true before he repeats it, and no amount of correction is going to get him to stop saying that thing. We've seen this on story after story after story, and we're seeing it again.
Ruth, even Republicans like North Carolina Senator Tom Tillis, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, defended the Biden administration in the FEMA response. What's the best way to combat the misinformation Trump and J.D. Vance and some of their supporters have been spreading?
Boy, I wish I had a really good answer to that, because the best way to combat it is to call it out, to have Republicans, responsible, traditional, honest Republicans, calling it out and providing the accurate information. But this is just so beyond distressing. Look, hurricanes and natural disasters in an election season always carry political risks, and especially for candidates who are the incumbents or quasi-incumbents in office. But the misuse of this, the big lie brought to the stage of a natural disaster, this is, beyond eating pets. And Ramesh is completely right. The craziest, flimsiest rumor is something that he will seize on and amplify and repeat. There's no shame on his part, and it's very, very, because he has such a huge megaphone, it's very difficult to combat.
I just saw something here because I'm listening to you guys, but I'm also looking over here, keeping tabs on any potential breaking news. And one thing popped up that I forgot to ask, that came out of Donald Trump's speech at the Detroit Economic Club, a policy proposal that he dropped in the middle. Yes.
How did
yes,
that happen?
a proposal he dropped in the middle of that. I think it was a 2-hour speech, 90-minute speech. And the proposal is to make car loans tax deductible. This comes on top of not taxing tips, and there was one other proposal.
Overtime.
Yes, and not taxing overtime. If you have any thoughts about this particular proposal, does it make sense, or is this pandering?
Well, as I understand it, this is a return to the policy that we had before the 1986 tax reform. But the thing is, there's no overall structure or coherence to these proposals. It's just a tax cut for you and a tax cut for you and a tax cut for you, anybody he happens to be speaking in front of at the moment. And there's no plan to make the numbers add up, except this basically fantastic idea that you're just going to raise tariffs enough to make up all the revenue. In Detroit, he was talking about, he was musing, let's say, about 1,000% tariffs. Doesn't matter if you do 1,000% tariffs. Well, first of all, if you have 1,000% tariffs, you're not going to have imports, so you're not going to raise revenue out of it. But also, even if you got the full value of all imports and converted it all into taxes, it's not enough to make up for the income tax. So it's just, it's fantasy land economics.
And it's targeted pandering. It's targeted to the obvious audience that he was in front of, that he was busy insulting, by the way, but the audience that he was in front of. And it's irresponsible pandering because, as Ramesh points out, there's no explanation of how any of these proposals are paid for. And I would say one more thing, which is, these are not the first two candidates who are guilty of this, but there's bipartisan pandering and there's bipartisan irresponsibility, and it's not. I'm quick to say it's not equivalent. Kamala Harris's proposals are much less irresponsible than Donald Trump's proposals. We had assessments and estimates by the Center for a Responsible Federal Budget this week that showed how much more, trillions and trillions and trillions more, not to sound too Carl Sagan-like, Donald Trump's plans would cost than Kamala Harris's plans. But neither candidate is addressing seriously how they would pay for the cost of their proposals, and neither candidate is addressing seriously how they would deal with the mounting federal debt.
Let's broaden the aperture here from specific policy proposals to the bigger issue of the peaceful transfer of power. Ramesh, you wrote this week about the difficulty of top Republicans like House Speaker Mike Johnson and Vice Presidential nominee Senator J.D. Vance have, to this day, of acknowledging that President Biden won the 2020 election. What gives here?
Well, I think that they are resentful of being asked this question. They see it as a trap. They see it as a gotcha question. But the trap is completely of their own devising. It is because the party, because of Trump, has invested so deeply in the lie that Trump won. And so what you'll see is Republicans mostly trying to deflect and evade the question. So what Speaker Mike Johnson said, which is also what Vice Presidential nominee Vance said at the debate, is, I'm focusing on these other issues. I'm focusing on the future. Why do you want to talk about the past? Meanwhile, Trump talks about it every day, practically, about how he supposedly won and there was massive fraud that supposedly stole the election from him. And it's just one of the things I point out is you can't, I think, really say, well, it's an open question whether the last election was stolen, but I want to talk about something else. I mean, if this really were true, if it weren't completely made up, then of course it would be your top issue. Of course it would be something that you talked about every day. And so in a way, it's actually less credible than the conspiracy nonsense because it's so obviously politically designed way to sort of have their cake and eat it too.
Ruth, what do you think? Because what do you think of the motivation? Is the motivation that they actually believe the election was stolen? Or is the motivation they know that the election wasn't stolen, they just don't want to rile Donald Trump?
Number two, door number two, Jonathan, door number two. I mean, it is completely clear that they know the election wasn't stolen. The most they can muster on their side when they are pressed to get to the actual facts is to stutter some things about rule changes late in the game, and this caused concern among people. But there is no credible evidence that the election was tainted or rigged, or use any of the other words that Donald Trump uses, in any way. They are motivated by the one thing that seems to unite the Republican Party and certainly Republican elected officials, which is absolute fear of Donald Trump and absolute fear that if they say something that offends His Highness, that the Republican base will punish them. And we have seen that happen. We have seen him riled up. We have seen the base punish people. And fear is the motivating fact here.
Let's close with the Middle East, where we are now in the second year of the Israel-Hamas war. Before I ask this question, Ruth, I have sitting in my drafts an email I was going to send you months ago after a column you wrote about sort of the generational tensions within Jewish families, and in the email says basically, I mean, you're a phenomenal writer, Ruth, on everything, but your columns on what's been happening since the Hamas attacks on October 7th have been, to my mind, your best writing. I learned so much from what you put in those columns, and you had a column this week about Yom Kippur coming 1 year after the Hamas attacks. And I want to put on the screen now something you wrote. You wrote, "These greetings do not apply this year, the most difficult and dangerous for the Jewish people in my lifetime." And I know I read this quote out of context, Ruth, but please put this quote in context and talk more about what you were talking about there.
Well, first of all, Jonathan, that really means a lot to me, and thank you so much. It has been, I just made a decision to write very personally about, over the course of this long year, what it has meant to me, to my family, and not that I speak for all Jews because we're a fractious bunch, but what it's meant for the Jewish people. The greetings that I talked about are the traditional New Year's and Yom Kippur greetings that we give to have a sweet New Year. It's hard to imagine a sweet New Year given the horror that we see all around us on multiple sides of this conflict, by the way, I have to say. And we wish on Yom Kippur, which begins tonight, I'll be in synagogue with my mom who just turned 90. Happy birthday, Mom. And we will, I am so thankful to have her with me, but it's we wish an easy fast on Yom Kippur. And what I say in the piece is that you can't have an easy fast when so many horrible things are happening, when the state of Israel is in such perilous condition, when so many people, innocent children, are being killed in Gaza and killed in Lebanon. And everybody, we grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust, but that was a past horror. And now we're living in a moment when, almost the very survival of Israel is a question, and the emergence of anti-Semitism across the world and in the United States and on college campuses. I never thought I'd live to see the day when I was thankful that my children were no longer on college campuses, so they didn't have to face that. And as you mentioned, Jonathan, also the intergenerational tensions that many Jewish families, including my own, are feeling as we debate Israel's behavior, which much of which I do not condone. So it's been a long and difficult year, and it's going to be. It was very, very wrenching to be in synagogue for Yom Kippur last week, and as we atone for our sins beginning tonight, or I began earlier, I've got a lot to atone for. It's painful this year because Judaism, and Israel are in a perilous condition.
Ruth, what is your hope, or what are your hopes in the new year, for the new year?
That Israel can find wise leadership to bring a just conclusion to this war. And when I say this war, it's now really a two-front war, and to find a way to deal with the really painful paradox that Israel has confronted since last October 7th, which is the most horrific attack on Jewish people and the Jewish state since the Holocaust has somehow ended with Israel having turned itself not into a victim, but into an international pariah. Israel needs to find the sensible, rational, humane, sustainable way out of this. And that has not happened in the last long year. And I pray that it will happen in the next year, but I'm not sure I have very high confidence that it will.
And Ramesh, just to pick up on Ruth's wish for what she said is a just conclusion, I'm just wondering, do you think that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu want the just conclusion that Ruth is talking about?
Well, I think that Netanyahu is both reflecting and constrained by a political consensus inside Israel, as fractious as Israeli politics can often be. I think that there's been a pretty strong support for a pretty hawkish line over this last year. I agree with so much of what Ruth has to say about this, but I do wonder whether the trade-off between, and I agree, the diplomatic problem that Israel has, as she called it, pariah status. On the other hand, I think there's been a significant weakening of Iran by Israel, particularly through the decimation of Hezbollah. And I do wonder whether that trade-off might, in the long run, end up working out for Israel. I think there's probably a lot of Israelis, not just Netanyahu, who would say that it is worth it.
Ruth Marcus, Ramesh Ponnuru, thank you both very much for coming back to First Look. Have a good weekend.
You too.
And thank you for watching, but most importantly, for being loyal subscribers. I'm Jonathan Capehart. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look.